Good morning. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I'd also like to thank Molly Hofsummer and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for coordinating this hearing, and I especially want to thank our witnesses for their attendance. We are here today to bring attention to the human rights issues facing the indigenous peoples of the world. This is the final hearing in a series that we have held on indigenous peoples. Previously, we examined Latin America and Africa. This time, we turn our attention to Asia. According to the United Nations and the study on the problem of discrimination against indigenous people, indigenous refers to ethnic communities who have resided in a region for extensive periods of time, predating the arrival and settling of another dominant ethnic community. When the newly arrived community becomes the main political, economic, and social power, indigenous peoples frequently become a marginalized minority facing various forms and degrees of discrimination. It is estimated that the global indigenous population amounts to somewhere between 300 to 500 million, occupies 20% of the land surface, and can be found in nearly all countries on the planet. A sizable number of those people are in Asia itself, with over 700 indigenous groups consisting of an estimated 250 million people. Despite the vast differences amongst the native populations, many of the problems they face are universal for indigenous peoples. High rates of poverty, low life expectancy, and rampant malnutrition are just some of the challenges indigenous communities are living with today. These groups often lack fundamental civil and political rights, making self-determination difficult. Access to justice is only a dream for many, and far too frequently, indigenous people are the subjects of human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances. Some Asian countries have created legislative provisions aimed at protecting indigenous people within their states. In many cases, however, these regulations are either overlooked or ignored. Alternatively, these groups are simply recognized as minorities, which does not provide the same protections they would otherwise be entitled to if they were classified as indigenous peoples. The way of life for Asian indigenous peoples is also threatened by forces of change in the name of development and globalization. Populations face the challenges of land loss, population growth, warfare, environmental degradation, and economic marginalization. Today, we will review the general situation of indigenous peoples in Asia and then look more closely at specific case studies. The Adivasis, am I saying that correctly? Want to correct me? Adivasis, thank you very much. Adivasis in India, the Rohingya of Burma, and the native peoples of Gilgit Baltistan. Okay, all right. I just so it knows, a lot of people down here in Washington have trouble understanding my Massachusetts accent when I pronounce things in English, so I apologize for the mispronunciation. Region of Pakistan. While this is only a small sampling of the millions of indigenous peoples, I hope it will bring attention to the scale of challenges facing indigenous peoples throughout Asia. It is my hope that the United States becomes a leader in protecting and promoting indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, a right that is critical to the survival and the well-being of these groups. Only when people are able to speak with their own voice can they truly be protected. So, having said that, I want to welcome our panel. Sophie Richardson, Advocacy Director of the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Rashmi Eka, Founder and Executive Director of the Adivasi Development Network. Jennifer Quigley, Advocacy Director of U.S. Campaign for Burma. Sengay Sering, Institute for Gilgit Baltistan Studies? Okay, all right. Anyway, I apologize. It's for my terrible pronunciation. I apologize especially to the reporter here who's trying to get my I would just say that along with the oral testimony presented, I would submit into the record written testimony from all of our witnesses here today. Let me see. Having said that, let me begin with Ms. Richardson.
Thanks, Mr. McGovern. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Since I can't possibly improve on the introduction that you've just given about the broad problems, I want to talk about two of the specific issues that came up repeatedly when I canvassed my colleagues who work regularly on 16 countries across Asia. These were the two most frequently cited problems that indigenous communities faced. The first is that while Human Rights Watch does not take a position on the merits of particular self-determination claims, obviously we feel very strongly about the right of people to engage in those discussions. And our research shows that some governments in the region continue to criminalize peaceful expressions of distinct identity or aspirations for self-determination by labeling such behavior as treasonous or as a form of terrorism. I wanted to particularly point today to a couple of reports that we've done about Papua and the Moluccas in Indonesia. We could obviously have a long conversation on this subject also about Uyghurs. But in Papua, we've documented that the Indonesian government has prosecuted and imprisoned more than 100 peaceful political activists for doing nothing more than calling for self-determination or otherwise engaging in peaceful expressions of identity. This has included acts such as waving the flags of Papua or the RMS Moluccan flag, which the Indonesian government has in tension with international law and indeed the Indonesian constitution, now regulated as being a form of treason. Simply to fly one of these flags constitutes treason. Many of the people that we interviewed who'd been imprisoned on these charges had been tortured while in custody. In one case, we documented Johan Teterisa was sentenced to 15 years in prison for treason for unfurling a flag at a public dance in the southern Moluccas in 2007 that had been attended by President Yudhoyono. And we have documented similar abuses against people engaged in peaceful expression of identity or self-determination in Burma, Cambodia, China, India, Nepal, among others. The other issue I'd like to draw some attention to is the failure to uphold laws that are crucial to indigenous communities. Governments often fail to recognize or uphold laws, particularly on collective land rights of indigenous communities. I wanted to draw particular attention to the 2001 land law in Cambodia, which contains unprecedented recognition of collective land rights of indigenous communities by the state and provides for collective titling of indigenous lands. It also recognizes the practice of shifting cultivation as part of the traditional land management of indigenous communities, and this is laudable in a context in which there's typically widespread prejudice against shifting cultivation practices, which are often misunderstood as slash-and-burn agriculture, and this is common in South and Southeast Asia. These biases have often been used as a basis for denying indigenous people the right to their lands. But the land law provisions related to indigenous communities in Cambodia have not been implemented and are frequently violated, favoring powerful private and state interests in the economic exploitation of land, fertile upland areas, forests, and natural resources traditionally used and managed by indigenous people. Key implementing legislation was not adopted until 2009, and to date, no indigenous community has actually received title to their collective lands. This is a problem that we have seen time and again across the continent, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this morning. The larger problem, I think, is that indigenous communities wind up bearing the costs of social inequities and environmental destruction, which is usually the result of corrupt governments seeking to benefit from economic development before resource tenure for land or natural resources is in place. We've written about these problems in at least a dozen different countries. I want to make a couple of quick recommendations about how the U.S. actually can become a leader in this realm. First of all, the international community as a whole needs to support and safeguard the rights of indigenous peoples as found in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This includes the rights to livelihood, education, and health, including registration of communal lands and recognition of traditional livelihoods. And the U.S. is in a position to do this not just through bilateral relationships, but also through its role in and influence over the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations, and others. Second, the U.S. should insist on better monitoring of the process of allocation of large-scale agro-industrial mining and tourism concessions in indigenous areas in Asia in order to assess their environmental and social impacts ensure their compliance with international and laws and standards, and guarantee, and this is the most important part, the free, prior, and informed consent of the affected Indigenous communities. Third, the U.S. needs to weigh in forcefully on cases in which Indigenous activists have been harassed, threatened, and arbitrarily arrested, or worse, for engaging in peaceful activism. We would like to see the U.S. ratify the ILO Convention number 169, which is the convention concerning the rights of Indigenous people, and that is a legally binding document. Last but not least, and this is a subject we've discussed in a couple of different contexts, I think the U.S. needs to do a much better job when it's making decisions about military assistance to ensure that the militaries who are seeking greater U.S. cooperation have not themselves been implicated in one way or another in violating the rights of Indigenous communities. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Ms. Eka.
Good morning and Johar. My name is Rashmi Eka, and I'm from the Oraon tribe of the eastern state of Jharkhand in India. I'm part of Adivasi Development Network. We're an organization that works for the empowerment of the indigenous peoples in India. According to the 2001 census, there were 85 million people who identified with different tribes across India. Now, if Adivasis are growing at the same rate as the rest of India, we're now 100 million strong people. That would be approximately a third of the United States population, and also a significant percentage of Asia's 260 million indigenous people. We collectively call ourselves Adivasis, Adi meaning first and Vasi meaning inhabitants. The government of India recognizes us as scheduled tribes in the Constitution. This recognition makes us beneficiaries of affirmative action in education and the public sector. With hundreds of tribes spanning the length and breadth of India, it's difficult for me to represent all of them. However, our problems are largely the same. We are isolated, economically, socially, politically, and geographically. We are the lowest point of every socioeconomic indicator. Economic challenges. Adivasis make some of the poorest people in the world. India's per capita income is $1,265. In my state, where 30% of the people are Adivasis, the per capita income is $99, meaning that the average Adivasi earns only 27 cents a day. Poverty brings with itself a myriad of problems, the primary three being lack of education, lack of access to healthcare and nutrition, and lack of economic opportunities. Only 27% of Adivasi women in my state are literate, compared to a national average of 54%. With low levels of education, employment prospects are few and far between. Most Adivasis are smallholder agriculturists who depend on rain to grow their food. Severe food insecurity haunts them each year as they are given to the vagaries of drought and monsoons. Food insecurity has severe consequences on our children as well. Many of us did not receive the proper nutrition between the ages of 6 months and 2 years, and this has led to physical and mental stunting. Malnutrition is high at 77% for babies and 68% for pregnant mothers. Another consequence of food insecurity is the mass exodus from the rural areas to the urban centers. The men take on jobs in mining, construction, and other sectors and live in urban slums. Girls as young as 10 are trafficked into bonded labor. As domestic help, they are often physically and sexually abused. Socio-cultural isolation. Adivasis are not part of the Indian caste system. Historically, our status is hence that of mlecha, or the barbarian. Because we have been traditional forest dwellers and meat eaters, we have been perceived as rakshasas, or demons, in the ancient books. This mindset severely handicaps our integration into the mainstream culture. We are discriminated against on the basis of our ethnicity, our color, our religion, our language, and our cultural practices. We carry with ourselves a heavy baggage of low self-esteem. Mainstream culture often tells us that we are not beautiful, we are not intelligent, and we cannot be successful.